just going to share the word with you guys, and I'm just going to read for you guys. It's from the book of Mark, chapter 7, 32 to 35. And it says, "There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk. And they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh, he said to him, 'Ephata,' which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly." You see, in England, I believe it was 2011 when we went for the conference, there was this girl, and she was talking about her experience in an intercultural church. And she says, when she walks in a room and people are talking, she finds it difficult to hear what they're saying, because she feels she's just gone into a silent room and all these people are speaking, but she cannot hear the words. All she can see are mouths moving. And she would like to speak, but she can't. She can hardly speak their language, and so she's just quiet. And you see, this story is talking about the same thing. You see, John 1 verse 1 says Jesus is actually the Word. And so even Jesus' actions themselves, he was actually preaching, even though he didn't say a word. And so this is one of those scenarios where Jesus was preaching in his actions, speaking not to people who were physically deaf and dumb, but were spiritually deaf and dumb. And so he does the most crazy of things when we really read this. Instead of commanding this person to be able to hear or to speak like what he had done before, he does the most unusual things, like putting his ear in putting his finger in the man's ear, or spitting and putting his spit into this guy's tongue. This is crazy. Jesus, why are you doing this? You have the power to command everything to happen. You've done it before. Why in this case are you doing this? See, this is what Jesus did. The first thing he did was he took him aside. He's done this also to a blind man in Mark chapter 8. He took him to his side and he's saying, "Look, you spiritually deaf and dumb people, you cannot hear me because you're always with the crowd. You're always with the people you hang around with most of the time. You're always in your social networks. But for you to actually hear me, I need you to step aside and come into my presence." Amen. That's step one. That is what Jesus did right here. And he does another crazy thing. He takes his finger and he puts it in the man's ear. Jesus, what are you doing? You see, for the person to actually hear, even when he's coming to God's presence, Jesus had to take out the dirt from this person's ear. Hear me? The dirt that goes in our ears from the music that we listen to. Jesus is saying, "I'm speaking, but you can't hear me because of what other things you're listening to." He says, "I have to clean your ears because this gossip that you're continuously listening to is stopping you from hearing what I have to speak to you." I wish I had more time, but let's go to the next thing. And he says, Jesus spit and he touched the man's tongue. You see, of all our fluids, the only place where we can get our DNA is probably our blood or the saliva. So for Jesus to take his DNA from himself and put in this man, he had to cut himself, but he didn't do that. He used the most accessible liquid that was in his body, which was the saliva. So Jesus takes the saliva, taking his DNA from himself, and he puts it in the man's tongue. So now Jesus' DNA is now in him. He's no longer himself, but he's going to be transformed into the image of God. Why is this important? Because we can be in the presence of God, we can clean out the dirt, but if we are not in the image, we cannot understand what he's saying because we are not one. So we have to be transformed into his image to be able to understand what he's saying. Because the word Jeremiah 29:11 says he has a plan, but you cannot understand that plan if you're not one, if you're not in his image. Let's go to the next thing. And Jesus looked up into heaven because he knows where his help comes from, and he says, and he sighs with a deep sigh. Jesus, why are you sighing? Are you tired, Jesus? What's the problem here? Jesus sighs because he is tired of constantly trying to speak to a person who's not willing to listen. He's constantly trying to speak to us, and someone stands in the front and says, "Oh, I heard God say," and we say, "How do you know that God told you?" Because you yourself had an experience it yourself. Jesus is constantly speaking. The problem is not him not speaking, but the problem is us not listening to him. And he goes on to the next thing and he says, be opened. Jesus is speaking to a person who cannot hear. You are deaf, and Jesus says, be open. Why is Jesus speaking to a deaf person? Could it be that Jesus is not talking to the person, but he's actually speaking to the spirit that is inside of the person? He says, be open, and immediately his ears were open. And another thing, his tongue was loosened. We can only loosen something if it was actually tied by something. So his tongue was actually tied. Jesus speaks to the spirit and says, be open, and immediately he can hear. His tongue is loosened. Why was his tongue loosened? Because a lot of us really want to speak about God to our friends, but you can't because our tongue is tied. Our tongue is tied by the relationships that we put ourselves in. We can't speak because our tongues are tied. We really want to pray to God, but we can't pray because our tongues are tied. You see, we come to God and the scripture said this person could talk, but he could hardly talk. So he actually could talk, but he could hardly talk. We actually want to come to church and pray, and we actually want to go home and spend time with God. And when you go down to pray, we can hardly pray because of our situations. We're being held down by what the world is putting into us. You see, we've got all these things that are pushing us away from God, so we want to pray, but we can hardly pray. This is amazing. When I read this, I was totally amazed, and I hope that at least one thing has convicted you of what Jesus was preaching in a miracle here. Amen. At least one thing. And so right now we just want to go before God and say, God, make me more aware of the times that I'm drifting away. I want my spirit to cry out when I'm not hearing from you. Because what kind of a father does not want a relationship with their child? What kind of a father would not want their child to speak to them or even at least speak about them? What kind of a father would not want to speak to their own child? That's not the God that we serve, people. That is not the God that we serve. And so if you're wondering, why doesn't God actually speak to me when he speaks to other people who stand in front and speak? Here's your answer. Here's your answer. Jesus has spoken to every single one of us in this room. Here's our answer. We want to hear from you, God. We want to speak to you. I want to pray and know that, God, you are listening. I just want us to go before God today. God, let us be sensitive. Let us go out of our comfort zones. Let us leave everything else in the world so that we can spend time with you and hear what you have to say to us. God is speaking. Are you ready to listen? Are you willing to listen? What are you going to do to make sure you hear what he has to say? Let us pray.